Hi friends! Today I'm gonna paint on CDs.
What?
Yeah, you know those old things people used to play music with? Yeah, they're worthless now that everything is digital, so I might as well paint on them. I did this once before, and you guys loved it so much that you never mentioned it again after I did it. But when has that ever stopped me? I wanted to do it again, so I'm gonna. So I have a bunch of old CDs. And when I say old, I mean old. Like these are from the late 90s and early 2000s. I have Now That's What I Call Music too. They just released volume 88. This is practically an antique. I should register it as a historical landmark. Lovely. Anyway, I think it's safe to say that no one wants these CDs. Except me, as tiny little canvases. The last time that I painted on CDs, I tried to clean the foil off of the CD, and it really didn't go so well. But I have a couple of ideas that I'd really like to try that would require a clear background. So I'm gonna try again. The method that I see everyone say works is that you scratch the foil with a knife and then use packing tape to pull the foil up. Every video I've watched of people doing this, it just works so perfectly. But for some reason, I cannot do it. It'll pull up the colored label first, but leave a layer of foil. And then you have to do more tape pulls to start to pull up the actual foil, but not all of it comes up. So I tried a few different things off camera, thinking that once I found a good method, I'd film that. But I never found a good method. On the first CD, I continued pulling with packing tape, but eventually a bunch of the tape adhesive got stuck on the CD. So I tried to clean that off, but then the CD just got cloudy. And there was still foil on the CD. So I just sanded that one down. Then I tried a different packing tape. And that worked a little better, but you can still see all of the scratch lines where I scored the foil. And I don't want that showing on a clear background. So on this third one, I tried scratching the color label off very gently with the backside of a ceramic knife, and then using the tape to pull it up. It's cleaner, but you can still see the scratches. So then on this one, I scratched one teeny tiny area with the thought that I could just paint on that spot, and then I used masking tape. For some reason, masking tape worked the best out of all of the tapes, but it still left some tiny little glittery bits of foil on the CD. And no matter how many times I went over it with the tape, they didn't come off. And I didn't know what else to try after that. So then I just gave up on the last two. I feel like I'm really close to finding a method that works for me, but clear CDs are out of the question for this video. So to cover up this mess, I'm gonna gesso these, just so I can cover some of the rough scratchy areas and start with a nice white base coat. Now on some of the CDs, the gesso sort of rejected the idea of going onto the CD. It seemed to happen more on the smoother ones, so maybe there's some coating on there, or maybe gesso just likes something to grip onto. Either way, it was not a love connection. But once that first layer dried and I went in with a second coat, they started to get along a lot better. And I finally had a nice even base. So on to the actual painting. The last time I painted on CDs, I really wanted to do a donut, but I held myself back. But this time, I can't be contained. I'm doing it. But I'm gonna try and change it up a little and do a realistic painting of a donut. And I had this brilliant idea to only use my brush tip paint markers. My thinking was, I can paint with an actual brush, but I won't need to mix the colors. Foolproof plan. I did use actual paint for the cake part of the donut because I didn't have the color I wanted. And my donut is gonna have pink frosting because for some reason all of my donuts have pink frosting. But the flaw in my plan is that I not only have no idea how to do realism, but I don't know how to blend with paint markers. I tried going in with a lighter color for the highlights, then going back over with the original color, thinking the highlight would show through, but no, the paint is too opaque. So I tried a different marker and smudging it with my finger. And I kept trying things, going back and forth between colors, trying different and wilder colors. God, this just keeps getting worse. It doesn't even look like a donut anymore. It looks like an ugly 70s flower. So I went back over everything with the original pink to block out all of those mistakes. And while that was drying, I tried to work on the cake part. I added a little shading around the edge of the donut using my smudge method, and added some shadows around the edge of the frosting. I said shadows. There we go. Now, that looks pretty good, so let's try again on this frosting. I swatched my colors first, picked them very carefully, and tried to blend out a gradient. And that looks even worse than anything I did before. So I finally just gave up on realism. And so for the last time, I went over everything to get one flat color. At this point, I've lost track of how many coats of paint this is. Now, instead of realism, I'm gonna try something called cell shading. It's like big blocky shading, similar to the kind of cartoon shading that I usually do. But I'm going to use a few different pinks that progressively get lighter to highlight areas of the frosting. I did have to do a couple of coats of each to fully cover the monstrosity underneath, and I used a lot of reference pictures. But it's already looking better than anything I did before. And last, because no donut is complete without them, I added sprinkles. Ooh, that was a wild, wild ride to get to this point. But I really do like how this turned out. I guess maybe I should practice my realism a little more though. So another idea I had the first time I painted on CDs was obviously to paint a rainbow. And a lot of the comments were saying that I should have done that. So this time I'm going to. But I'm going to start out with a sort of bluey indigo background with some real wispy and kinda ugly clouds. Wow, you can barely see what's happening with that glare, but trust me, they are ugly. But they're gonna get covered up mostly anyway. Because I'm not just gonna do one rainbow, I'm gonna do a bunch of rainbows. And they're gonna be coming out of colorful pastel clouds. This was one of the ideas that I thought would be really pretty with a clear background. But we know how that went. I used pretty soft colors for the clouds, but I really wanted the rainbows to pop. So I used my Poscas for those to be sure that I would get super bright colors. And now that the rainbows are done, I can clean up the edges on the clouds and fill them in so they're a little bit more opaque. So that I didn't make the same mistake I made on the donut, I went right in with cell shading, using progressively darker colors. And I did use references for this again because I wanted it to be a little more something than the usual way I do shading. Usually I just draw a line at the bottom edge or sometimes a blob, but this looks more illustrative. I don't know if that's the right word, but I like the way this looks. And with that, this CD is done. I really like how this came out, and I'm not even mad that I didn't get a clear background. The next idea I had was a pretty simple one, so I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the background. And instead of a flat color, I decided to do a gradient from purple to blue to green. I also wanted to practice my blending skills. And I am getting better, slowly. I did have to work in layers, making sure to dry the paint in between so that it didn't pull up the paint beneath it. But eventually, I got it to where I thought it was looking okay. I'm not a giant fan of these colors, but I was trying to use up some paint that I already had mixed before it gets super chunky. So, it'll do. You might remember over the summer, I customized a wind chime and painted cherry blossoms all over it. And I loved it so much that I've been wanting to paint cherry blossoms again. I mean, they were so easy to do, and I had so much fun the entire process that I didn't want to stop. Most art goes through a kind of ugly phase, but I don't feel like painting cherry blossoms ever has an ugly phase. So using my brush tip markers, I painted out some branches. And I did go with my usual single line method for shadows and highlights. Then I went in with a super light pink for the cherry blossom flowers. When I did the wind chime, I just used dots for the flowers, but this time I went just slightly more detailed with 3 and 4 petal flowers. And it is incredibly hard to stop adding flowers. Like, it just looks so good as soon as you start putting them in that you just want to keep adding more and more and more. But I really tried to hold myself back from covering the entire branch. Then I went in with some darker pinks to add some depth and dimension. Depth and dimension. I'm such a professional. After that, I didn't want the fun to end, so I added some tiny little leaves everywhere. And then I shaded those too. Finally, even though I didn't want to stop, I couldn't think of anything else to add. And I had to call it done. I had such a good time with this painting. It was so quick and came out so pretty. I could probably paint an entire wall with cherry blossoms and love every second of it. So for this next CD, I'm going for another blendy background. Blendy clouds, to be exact.
Wait, what? Weren't we just here?
Yes, but this was actually another idea that I had that I wanted to use a clear background for. I really wanted to paint butterflies on a clear CD, but when that didn't work out, I had to come up with a background that would work. And I wanted to use up some more paint that I already had mixed. So I settled on pink clouds in a blue sky. And I feel like the clouds actually came out much better than the first set I painted. For the bottom half, I went with green and yellow grass. Not super thrilled with how the grass turned out, but I'm trying to remind myself that it's not going to be the focal point of the art. And it's going to be covered up mostly anyway. So for the butterflies, I went back to my paint markers. I wanted all of these butterflies to have a little color gradient in them. And while I didn't have super high hopes with blending these markers, I just decided to go for it anyway. So I started by sketching out the butterfly in the outermost gradient color. Then I blocked in the colors I wanted to make a gradient with. And I just went back and forth between the colors, overlapping them to try to blend the gradient. It might have been because the paint was still wet, or it might have been that I tried to do lighter and lighter strokes each time, but it did end up blending pretty well. It's not as smooth as what I probably could have done with regular paint and a brush, but it's really not terrible. Plus, I'm going to add black markings to the wings, so that will cover some of it up. This second and third butterfly were a little bit harder because I added a few more shades into the gradient. But I just followed the same process, working slowly and focusing only on blending between 2 colors at a time. Looking back at these in editing, they probably could have stood to have at least one more coat to blend them out more, but I was too excited to move on to the markings. And these were actually the hardest part. Even though butterfly markings look really random, there does seem to be a sort of specific pattern to them. Like the stripes move in a certain direction, and I feel like you can just tell when they aren't right. Maybe that's just me. Even still, the markings are my favorite part to do because they're so pretty and they really give the butterfly a finished look. There's just something about painting butterflies that I find so satisfying. They're not even something that I specifically love aesthetically, like desserts or cute animals are. Like, I don't have a lot of butterfly decor or anything. Painting them is so fun. I added some sort of creepily large bodies to the butterflies, and then I added white dots to the outermost part of the wings. I tried to make them more blobby shaped than polka dots, but I'm still not sure they look like part of the markings and not like weird added sparkles or something. Maybe I should have used an off-white color instead. Either way, this CD is done, and I am very pleased with it. feel pretty happy with how the blending came out, which gave me the confidence to try one more time at realism. And for this one, I'm going to paint a bug. Yes, a bug. Specifically, one of these pretty iridescent beetle things. I've had this picture saved on my phone in my ideas folder for a long time. There's just something about it that called to my soul to draw it or paint it. So I decided now is the time to work on it. First, I sketched out a rough outline with a green colored pencil. Then I'm going to go in with purple for the background because I feel like purple will really contrast nicely with green and copper. After a couple of coats, I'm going to add a little bit of a vignette to the outside with a darker purple. Then I'm going to try something new and add a little bit of a green underpainting to the beetle. I'm hoping this will help once I start going over it with the paint markers to sort of help the colors meld. And back to working on blending the background a little bit more. Now for the actual painting. My plan is to work in sections, alternating between colors and blending them in multiple layers the way that I did with the butterflies. And at first, this isn't looking too bad. I mean, it's certainly not great, but not too bad either. Then I got to this darker green color, and for some reason I started making small dabbing motions rather than like brush strokes. I have no idea why I was doing that, but I sort of liked how that looked better than what I was doing, so 8 minutes in and I completely abandoned my plan and decided to work in small dots to make the colors blend out. I did use solid lines around each section to sort of help define the area and make the darkest shadows. After this section was done, I was pretty happy with how it looked. Not exactly realism, but also kind of cool looking. So I moved on to the head, but I found myself continuing to go back to the below the head area to adjust it. When I moved down to start on the wings, I put the reference photo down right next to the CD I was working on, so it was easier to make direct comparisons. And I slowly worked through the colors on the wings, and kept going back up to this other area to fiddle with it. The good thing about this dotting, stabbing method is that you can just keep going over areas, adding more dots to add color, or cover up colors that there are too much of. The bad thing is that you might never feel like it's done, and just continue to go back and forth. I think the problem I'm having is that I have 3 different sets of brush tip markers, but none of them have a dark enough green or brown to get the shading to more closely match the picture. So no matter how many times I went over areas, I just couldn't get them right. For the limbs, I started with a black marker to draw them out and get the shapes right, and then I went over them with greens to highlight them. So the black was more of a shadow. And I sort of wish I'd done a black underpaint on the beetle instead, because maybe that would make the dark parts appear darker, but honestly, who knows if that would have worked. Last, I added in his eyes. And this one is done. Honestly, he's not my favorite. I do like him, but I feel like I didn't really get to capture whatever essence originally drew me to this picture. So I'll probably try to paint him again sometime in the future. And that's all I had time for. Overall, I had a really great time painting these. It's almost like I tricked myself into painting 5 tiny little paintings by telling myself I was just decorating something else. What do you think? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.